strange. She was a little different, you know. But they said that about my sister too. She was quiet, you know. She wasn't a social person. So just because you're quiet and you're a little different than everyone else doesn't mean that you're a murderer. She loved him. She had never had a boyfriend before. You know, every day in my purse I carry Keyona's high school diploma. Because that's like her last and greatest accomplishment. There'll be no grandkids, you know.
16 months after a double murder inside a house on the southeast side of Grand Rapids, firefighters were called back to that exact same address. Inside, they found 2 more bodies, not strangers. Not new victims from a new tragedy. A 65-year-old grandmother and her 5-year-old great-grandson both pulled from a house fire that started during a private memorial gathering, a candle left burning for 2 loved ones the family had already lost.
It's been 3 years since a killer gunned down 2 women inside their home here on Sheldon Southeast. That house is gone now, bulldozed after fire tore through it, a fire fueled by the heartbreak that came before.
Their names were Jacqueline Baber Bay and little Amarian Cummings. Jacqueline was the woman who owned that house, the matriarch who'd opened her home to her daughter, her granddaughter, and her granddaughter's boyfriend, never imagining any of it would end the way it did. Amarian was her great-grandson, a child with his whole life still ahead of him. And their deaths mean that one single address in Michigan swallowed 4 members of the same family in under a year and a half. 2 of them shot, 2 of them burned. And the man whose actions set this entire chain of tragedy in motion has never spent a single night behind bars for any of it. To understand how a family loses 4 people to the same house, we have to go back to where it started, and to a man everyone in that family trusted enough to let him move in.
GRPD is hoping that's the case as they continue to search for a person of interest in a double homicide at this yellow home.
553 Sheldon Avenue Southeast, Grand Rapids, Michigan. A yellow house on a quiet residential block, the kind of street where neighbors wave at each other and nothing bad is ever supposed to happen. On the morning of March 13, 2019, a Grand Rapids police dispatcher answered a call that lasted less than a minute. On the other end was a young woman, whispering, barely audible, like she was trying not to be heard by someone standing right next to her.
Hello? Okay, where are you located? 553 Sheldon. Okay, can you tell me what's going on there?
Can you just hurry up, please? I'm gonna die. You're trying to kill me. You already killed my name. Just hurry up, please.
That was the entire call. The line went dead. And what happened in the hours after that whisper is one of the most infuriating, most heartbreaking failures you will ever hear in a true crime story. Because this isn't a case about a killer who was clever. It isn't a case about a perfect crime. It's a case about a woman who did everything right, who followed every rule you're supposed to follow when your life is in danger, and it still wasn't enough. Let's take you back to the beginning. Keyona Alexis Griffin was born on March 8, 1994 in Michigan. The daughter of Anya and Johnny Griffin, she had a brother, Stanford, and a family that by every account was extremely close. Keyona lived with her aunt, Charlotta Baber Bay, a woman in her mid to late 40s who was more like a second mother than an aunt. The 2 of them shared a home at 553 Sheldon Avenue, a house that belonged to Keyona's grandmother, Jacqueline. It was supposed to be a place of safety. A family home, 3 generations under one roof, the kind of house where holidays happened and birthdays were celebrated and nothing was ever supposed to go wrong. But there was a 4th person living there too, Charlotta's boyfriend, a man named Daryl Demon Brown. Now here's where the story takes a turn that will make your blood boil, because Daryl Brown wasn't just some stranger who wandered into their lives. Years earlier, a local Grand Rapids pastor, Reverend Robert Dean, had taken Brown in when he was homeless, let him stay at the church, gave him odd jobs. Shoveling snow, cutting grass, by all accounts Brown seemed harmless, quiet, unassuming, the kind of man you'd walk past on the street and never think twice about. He was always very helpful, the Reverend would later say. I don't think there was anything quirky, totally mild-mannered. Mild-mannered men can be hiding something underneath. And in Daryl Brown's case, that something had already surfaced once before, years before he ever met Charlotta Baber Bay. Back in 2005, a woman filed a police report against Brown.
Court records document Brown's explosive violence toward women. In 2005, another woman, the mother of one of Brown's children, told police he thought she had gotten smart with him, so he tied her up with cords, kicked her in the face, gagged her, urinated on her, and doused her with lighter fluid. She escaped and later wanted the charges dropped because she said she still loved him, knew he needed help, and did not think he would get it in prison. Brown ultimately pleaded guilty to misdemeanor domestic violence.
A slap on the wrist for a man who had held a woman at gunpoint and threatened a murder-suicide. That was 14 years before he moved into a yellow house on Sheldon Avenue with Charletta Baber-Bay and her niece. We didn't have any reason to think this man would commit murder, Keyona's mother, Anya, later told reporters.
She didn't have any boyfriends really during high school, so this was her first, kind of someone who paid attention to her. And at first he seemed nice.
The family had no idea about his history, no idea what he was capable of. Charletta saw a man who needed help, who needed structure, who needed love, and she gave it to him. She had no way of knowing she was inviting a loaded gun into her home. And that's the part of this story that so many people who have heard it can't get past. This wasn't a random home invasion. This wasn't a stranger who broke in through a window. This was a man who ate dinner at that table, who slept in that house, who, for all anyone knew, was just a quiet, helpful boyfriend trying to get his life back together.
She was a little different, but they said that about my sister too. She was quiet, she wasn't a social person. So just because you're quiet and you're a little different than everyone else doesn't mean that you're a murderer.
Let's get to the morning that changed everything. March 13, 2019 started like any other day. But at some point that morning, inside that yellow house, something went wrong. We don't know the full sequence of what triggered it, but we know how it ended. Daryl Brown shot Charletta Baber-Bay once in the back of the head. And somewhere in that house, Keyona Griffin, just 5 days past her 25th birthday, was still alive, terrified, hiding, and she managed to get to a phone. She dialed 911, and she whispered,
553 Sheldon. Okay, can you tell me what's going on there?
Just hurry up, please. I'm gonna die. You're trying to kill me. You already killed my auntie. Hurry up, please.
Investigators would later say Keyona's voice was so quiet, so controlled, that she was clearly trying to avoid detection. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't panicking out loud. She was doing exactly what you're supposed to do in an active threat situation. Stay low, stay quiet, get the information out, and wait for help. She had the presence of mind, in what were likely the most terrifying moments of her life, to give dispatch her exact address and describe the color of the house. Think about that level of composure under that level of fear. Help was 7 minutes and 41 seconds away. 3 Grand Rapids police officers arrived at the yellow house. One knocked on the front door, 3 times with his fist, once with the door knocker. Nothing. He tried the doorknob, locked. He asked dispatch to try calling the number back. Dispatch said the caller wasn't picking up. Another officer checked a side door, also locked. One of them peered through a window. You can see it looks like a little dining room or something in there. It's empty, the officer said. Quiet, no signs of forced entry, no visible threat, no one answering. And so, after a few minutes on scene, the officers left. They treated it as an unfounded call. A dead line, a locked door, an empty room through a window. No indication in their minds that 2 women were bleeding out somewhere inside that house. What they didn't know, what nobody outside that house knew, was that dispatch had failed to relay the most critical detail. Later reporting revealed that key words from Keyona's call, the words, "He already killed my auntie," were not clearly communicated to the responding officers before they arrived. Some of that breakdown, to this day, remains legally shielded. When journalists tried to obtain the internal affairs interviews with the dispatcher and the officers, the city blacked out 7 of 11 pages, citing a law that protects certain statements made by law enforcement officers from disclosure. So the very words that might explain exactly what went wrong that morning are, officially, none of the public's business. Sit with that for a second. A woman said the words, "He already killed my auntie," to a 911 dispatcher, and somehow, in the chain of communication between that call and 3 officers standing on her porch, those words never made it through. We may never know exactly why. The officers drove away. And inside that yellow house, if Keyona was still alive when they knocked on that door, she had no way of telling them so. 2 hours passed. Hours in a quiet neighborhood on an ordinary Wednesday, while a family had no idea their world had already ended. And here's where the story gets even more chilling, because while Keyona and Charletta lay in that house, Daryl Brown wasn't hiding in a basement or holed up somewhere waiting to be caught. Surveillance cameras later recovered by police showed him walking on foot, calm in broad daylight about a mile north of the crime scene, 2 hours after the murders had already happened. In one of the places those cameras caught him going, the Grand Rapids Children's Museum. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who had just shot 2 women to death in the house he shared with them walked into a children's museum. Museum surveillance showed him entering at 3:24 in the afternoon and walking back out just 12 minutes later at 3:36. According to reports, he told the front desk staff he knew someone inside the building. Staff made it clear to him that wasn't going to work and he left. 12 minutes. In a children's museum, 2 hours after a double homicide. That detail alone tells you something about the kind of person Daryl Brown is. Not someone panicking, not someone frantically fleeing the state in a blind rush. Someone cold enough to blend into a room full of families and toddlers like nothing had happened at all. It was Keyona's brother, Stanford Cummings, who found her. He walked into that house not knowing what he was about to see and found his sister lying on the floor of an upstairs bedroom, not moving. He was the one who had to make the second call to 911, the call that confirmed what the first one should have prevented.
911 emergency.
From the 553 Sheldon, my sister not moving.
What's the address?
553 Sheldon, there's blood everywhere, my sister is not moving.
When police finally processed that scene, they found Charletta Bay dead from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. And Keyona Griffin, 25 years old, shot 4 times, once in the face. Investigators located the murder weapon still inside the home, a firearm that would later be found to have been stolen. Daryl Brown, by then, was long gone. And by the time anyone realized what had actually happened inside that house, he'd had, by the family's own estimate, roughly a 3-hour head start. Let that sink in. A man shoots 2 women in a house, one of them makes a 911 call begging for help. Police physically stand at the door and leave, and by the time anyone gets back inside, the killer has vanished into thin air with a 3-hour lead. Grand Rapids police would later say bluntly that knowing what they know now, they would have broken into that house after the first call. A police sergeant told reporters exactly that. But hindsight doesn't bring back the dead. And it certainly didn't bring back Daryl Brown. Now here's where this case stops being just a tragedy and starts becoming one of the most frustrating manhunts in recent American history. Grand Rapids police issued warrants almost immediately, and within weeks investigators had a working theory. Brown had fled to Atlanta, where he had family ties. Police there were put on alert. A mugshot from his 2005 domestic violence arrest was circulated, and for a while Atlanta felt like the answer. It wasn't. The trail went cold. Then nearly a year later, in February of 2020, Kent County prosecutors formally charged Brown with 2 counts of open murder, and the case caught a much bigger spotlight when it was featured on the Investigation Discovery series, In Pursuit with John Walsh. The same John Walsh behind America's Most Wanted. A man who has personally helped track down over 1,000 fugitives across his career. His son, Callahan Walsh, took the case directly to the airwaves in an episode literally titled Mother and Child, profiling Brown as, in the show's own words, an offender with a dark past who committed a violent, personal crime. That kind of national exposure usually cracks a case wide open. It didn't. Tips poured in. Investigators chased leads across state lines, and Brown just kept staying one step ahead. By 2021, with the case still unsolved and Brown still missing, prosecutors made a decision that tells you exactly how dangerous they believed this man to be. In July of 2021, the U.S. Marshals Service added Daryl Demon Brown to their list of the 15 most wanted fugitives in the entire country. That is not a list handed out lightly. That is a list reserved for the most dangerous, most elusive suspects in America. The kind of list that puts a $25,000 federal reward behind your face and puts your photo in front of millions of people. Looks very unassuming and could literally be standing behind you in a grocery checkout lane, said the acting U.S. Marshal in charge of the case. And that quote isn't just a scary soundbite. It's backed up by everything investigators actually know about how Brown has managed to survive as a fugitive for this long. Kent County's prosecutor at the time, Chris Becker, gave an explanation that should genuinely unsettle you. He said Brown has essentially lived off the grid his entire adult life. No steady job, no known friends. No social media accounts to track, no cell phone pinging off towers. None of the digital breadcrumbs that usually help investigators corner a fugitive in the modern era. People have social media, they have phones, they have things that you can connect, that you can trace, Becker said. But even when Brown was here, he didn't have a job. As far as we know, he didn't have friends. So there were no phones, no social media. In an age where almost every fugitive eventually slips up by posting the wrong photo or calling the wrong number, Daryl Brown was a ghost before he ever needed to become one. And it gets worse, because investigators believe he hasn't been surviving out there alone. The U.S. Marshals have stated publicly that they believe Brown is receiving active assistance from family members and associates to continue evading arrest. When a reporter went to the door of Brown's family home in Grand Rapids to ask questions, a woman inside told them to get away from the house. Brown, according to the Marshals, has relatives spread across Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and Ohio. A web of connections wide enough to disappear into again and again. And disappear he did, for years. Then, in August of 2020, police in Columbus, Ohio, announced they believed Brown was in or around their city, warning the public he was likely armed and dangerous. Another false dawn. He wasn't caught. Years went by. And then, in January of 2024, nearly 5 years after he vanished from that yellow house on Sheldon Avenue, police in Dayton, Ohio said someone matching Daryl Brown's exact description had been spotted in their area. Marshals reissued his description. Black male, black hair, brown eyes, 5'8", around 180 pounds, known to use the aliases J.J. Robinson, Michael Richardson, and Marcus Wright. A man who has spent 5 years wearing other names in other cities, possibly standing in line at a gas station near you or near someone you know, and simply walking away clean every single time. As of the most recent public reporting, Daryl Demon Brown has still not been caught. He remains on the U.S. Marshals' 15 most wanted list to this day, one of the longest-running unsolved fugitive cases connected to a double homicide in Michigan history. Let's talk about what this has done to Keyona and Charletta's family, because the manhunt is only half of this story. The other half is a family that has had to fight for basic answers about how their loved ones were failed by the very people who were supposed to protect them, all while grief kept finding new ways to return to their door. Just over 16 months after the murders, in July of 2020, the family gathered back at that same Sheldon Avenue house for a private memorial, a way of honoring Keyona and Charletta on their own terms. During that gathering, a candle was left burning and a fire broke out. Firefighters pulled 2 people from the house that morning, Jacqueline Baber-Bay, the 65-year-old grandmother who had owned the home and welcomed Daryl Brown into it in the first place, and her 5-year-old great-grandson, Emarion Cummings. Jacqueline was pronounced dead at the scene. Emarion was rushed to Helen DeVos Children's Hospital, where he later died. The same walls that had absorbed one act of violence in 2019 took 2 more lives in 2020, and this time there was no suspect to chase. Just an unbearable coincidence layered on top of an unbearable crime. In the years since the murders, Keyona's mother, Keyona Griffin, has publicly and repeatedly raised the question that haunts this entire case. What if officers had forced their way into that house the first time? What if that 7 minutes and 41 seconds hadn't ended with 3 men walking away from a locked door? Legal experts who have looked into the family's options say it's an incredibly difficult case to bring, tangled up in legal doctrines like qualified immunity, which often shields police officers from being held personally liable for split-second decisions made in the field, even when those decisions turn out to be catastrophically wrong. For a mother who lost both her sister and her daughter on the same morning, in the same house, legal doctrine doesn't change what's missing from her life. Keyona's 911 call has, in the years since, taken on a life of its own. It's been played and replayed on true crime podcasts, dissected on YouTube channels just like this one, and shared across social media by people who have never met her but can't stop thinking about her voice. Not because she was screaming, because she wasn't. Because in the last conscious act she may have ever had the chance to make, she stayed calm enough, controlled enough, brave enough to whisper her own address to a stranger on a phone in the hope that it would save her life. And it still wasn't enough. That's the sentence that should stay lodged in your chest after this video ends. So where does that leave things right now today? Daryl Demon Brown is still out there. Not hiding in some remote cabin in the woods, not living off the grid in the way you might imagine a fugitive would. He is, by every account investigators have given, hiding in plain sight. In a checkout line, at a bus stop, renting a room somewhere under the name Michael Richardson or J.J. Robinson or Marcus Wright, blending into a normal life while two women's families continue to wait for a knock on their own door, the one that tells them he's finally been caught. The U.S. Marshals Service is still actively pursuing this case, and the $25,000 reward for information leading directly to his arrest still stands. If you know anything, if the name Daryl Brown means anything to you, or if you've ever crossed paths with a quiet, unassuming man in his 50s who goes by one of those aliases, there's a number for that. 1-877-want-D-2. You can also submit a tip anonymously online at usmarshals.gov. Somewhere out there, right now, Keyona Griffin is still waiting. Still waiting for the call that tells her justice finally caught up to the man who took her sister and her daughter in the same house, on the same morning, while her daughter did everything a person is supposed to do to survive, and it still wasn't enough. She stayed quiet, she stayed calm, she told them exactly where to go, 7 minutes and 41 seconds. That's how close help actually was, and it still wasn't enough. Remember that the next time you think the system will always work the way it's supposed to. And remember Keyona Griffin's name, because 5 years later somebody out there still owes her family an answer.